Ladies and gentlemen, the UK at the moment is just doesn't really feel like a real country. I mean, so many weird things are going on over there. And this actually comes after the news. The UK's Foreign Secretary, David Lamie, has portrayed a rather weird kind of approach. And this is that he issued a statement in his constituency, which I might add is surrounded by many Muslims. He issued a piece denouncing Israel and its wars in Palestine. Now, first of all, the response to this is that Lamie has been accused of basically falling for Hamas propaganda and failing to stand with Israel in a time of crisis. Now, this is actually a really important point because many of the talking lines that he seems to be giving to the UK public as if they're fact are actually Hamas propaganda points. And Israel traditionally has actually had very strong support from the United Kingdom, and under these new Labour MPs, that seems to be wavering. You may ask the question as to why it's wavering. Well, in many instances, it's due to the mass migration occurring around the Westminster bubble. As we know, many of those areas are no longer British. In any case, the criticism of Lamie basically goes as follows, and that is that Israel is fighting a war described as an existential war. Now, the objectives of this war are to bring home the hostages, defeat jihadi threats, and be left in peace. Israel is a democracy in the Middle East and constantly seems to encounter enemies that use civilians as human shields, and no one really seems to notice that. So what exactly has gone on? Well, many individuals are noticing that Hamas and the UNRWA seem to be pushing forward forms of, propaganda. Nobody seemed to notice yesterday that multiple videos surfaced showing Hamas pushing Gazans who received Israeli-American aid. Now, in many instances, they are torturing and intimidating their own people, and this has led individuals to ask the question of why. Now, a group of Gazans reportedly protested Hamas, and so again, nobody's asking why. Why are these Palestinians protesting Hamas? Now, there is actually a reason for that, and that is because Hamas seems to be stopping Gazans from actually getting aid from the US. And they're doing this underneath a proviso of that they can then say, people are starving and dying, even though Hamas is perpetrating that in order to get that as a form of propaganda. Now, the UNRWA itself is not without blame because it's been accused of collaborating with Hamas. Yes, I know what you're saying. The UN accused of siding with Islamists and Hamas. That's never happened. Anyway, apparently the UNRWA is accused of having over 1,200 employees allegedly affiliated with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And this is according to Israeli intelligence. Now, this is the reason that Israel and the US actually avoids UN channels to deliver aid. Because the suggestion is that what's actually happening in Gaza is that Hamas is taking UN aid and selling it. They self-enrich and they're keeping it for themselves, and then the individuals on the ground aren't actually getting the aid, which is then leading to some forms of starvation, and then they get to go, look, it's all Israel's fault. And as you can see, the Gazans themselves are trying to get rid of Hamas, but very difficult to fight against them when you've got sticks and stones and they got AK-47s. So what did Lamie actually do? Well, Lamie called Israel's actions in Palestine grotesque and claimed that children asking for food were shot by Israeli soldiers, even though there's no evidence of that. He said he was sickened and appalled, and he said he threatened sanctions on Israel if a ceasefire isn't reached. Now, you see, this is the problem with many of these left-wing nutjobs. They do generally tend to love to criticize Israel, but they never criticize Hamas. And they seem to fail to understand that a ceasefire requires two parties. And Hamas continually sabotages negotiations because Hamas isn't interested in a ceasefire or negotiating. So how is Israel meant to have a ceasefire when the other party refuses to do so? No one seems to be able to explain this. Many individuals tend to forget that Israel did actually unilaterally withdraw from Gaza in 2005. And this gesture resulted in the creation of a terror state. And so the suggestions are that if they do so again, if they just leave at this point in time, you're going to have more atrocities and more instability. So it's not actually in the Palestinian interest to just, desert Gaza now. So the question has really become, why is Lamie suddenly a useful idiot for Hamas? And many have asked what's actually going on here. They've asked for the question, is he, I don't know, Muslim or something? And the answer is no, actually he isn't. He is an evangelical Christian from the Anglican faith. Well, if it's Church of England, that basically means he's, well, might as well be atheist, in my opinion. But in any case, what we're actually seeing here is actually Labour Party politics in action. Because many have accused the Labour Party now of being symbolic of woke and identity politics-driven governance. Everything that these individuals seem to want to promote all revolves around global racism and colonial issues. Now, many critics have argued that Lamie's comments range from being naive to oversimplistic to anti-Western or even anti-Israeli narratives, sometimes often lacking in forms of foreign policy depth. And you may say to yourself, well, why is that important? It's important because he's the UK Foreign Secretary. It's kind of his job to know, and yet he doesn't really seem to know. And so this has led some individuals to say that he's not actually suited for the job. Now, other individuals have said no, that what this actually shows is that he's concerned with human rights and global equality, and that he's principled and a modern internationalist, whatever that bloody well means. But in any case, what we can take from all this is that what he's actually showing is that he is firmly embedded in the Labour Party's traditions. Because the Labour Party itself has historically been more critical in terms of their views of Israelis' policies, especially in terms of the Palestinian issue. Yes, he has in the past criticized Hamas, but let's be honest, he is noticeably more disproportionately hostile towards Israel, and often attempts to frame Israel as being human rights violators, and this all seems to stem from basically Hamas propaganda. Now, in recent times, the Labour Party's Keir Starmer has tried to distance itself from its overt anti-Semitic scandals from the Corbyn era. But let's be honest, the factions in the party are still very pro-Hamas. They're very pro-Palestinian. And in many instances, what we are seeing is that there is a degree of moral outrage that's being demonstrated here in order to satisfy now the new local voters. So you may say that that statement of the local voters is maybe racist or unwarranted. But you see, you'd be wrong, because let's use the example of a Labour MP. And this is the Labour MP of Tahir Ali, who's the Birmingham, Hall, Green and Moseley MP. And he called for British troops to be deployed against the RDF to protect Palestinians from genocide. He claimed that the RDF had broken and erased international human rights standards in Gaza and referred to the Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu as pitting his middle finger up at the UK government whilst accusing Israel of committing genocide. Now, let's be fair to Lamie, he did refuse to support military intervention and instead reaffirmed the UK's call for a ceasefire and alleviation of civilian sufferings and the return of hostages. Now, he expressed awareness of the strong feelings in Parliament, but maintained that the UK would act diplomatically and not militaristically. But again, this is what we're seeing in the UK. In many instances, the feelings of outrage are being driven by, well, individuals who you wouldn't have said 300 years ago were native British individuals. So how did all of that actually happen? Well, they were talking in Parliament about the Druze scenario in Syria, and this is actually the minority in Syria that's currently being genocided. But nobody seems to care because they don't involve Palestinians and Israelis for some reason. In any case, there are currently over 1,000 dead in recent clashes between the Druze and some other Syrian tribes, with the Syrian internal security forces accused of siding with these tribes in order to massacre this minority. Now, the UK has urged Syria to investigate, protect civilians, and uphold rights. And it's very unlikely they're going to do that, to be honest, because they don't care. Now, you see, Israel tried to actually have a degree of moral fortitude in this, and Israel struck the Syrian Defense Ministry recently, claiming that Israel was trying to save their Druze brothers. And only 2 UK MPs raised the Druze genocide risk despite severe atrocities being reported of kidnappings, rapes, executions, mutilations, and also attacks on targeted Christians. Instead, what we saw is that many of the MPs attempted to return the focus to, well, Gaza. So despite there actually being an actual crisis in Syria of actual genocide, most of the MPs focused on Gaza and Israel, with escalating language. In fact, we actually saw Kate Malthouse suggesting that Lamie could end up at The Hague for failing to act against Israel. By the way, that was a Conservative MP. Stephen Flynn of the Scottish National Party criticised Lamie for not calling it a genocide and refusing to cut arms sales to Israel and not recognising Palestinian statehood. Several Labour MPs claimed that Israel was committing ethnic cleansing and genocide and called for sanctions and more aggressive UK policy towards Israel. And many would ask the question of why are these individuals so keen to raise these questions? Well, it's certainly not because historically the UK has been deeply pro-Palestine and anti-Israel, seeing as they gave the Jews the Israeli state. Anyway, let's move on. In any case, the UK government denies that it's Parliament's role to determine genocide and says that the matter is for the international courts. And they continue to support a two-state solution, and they reckon that they'll recognise a Palestinian state as and when the final negotiations proceed, and then there'll be peace. But you see, the final two-state solution will never occur because they don't want it to occur. Many individuals forget that if we wanted to go back to the pre-1948 borders, we would need to get the original Palestine, which is called Jordan, because that's where 70% of Palestine is. So why are they focusing on like the 30%? In fact, it's not even 30%. It's like 28% that's currently part of Israel. Well, we all know why. It's because it's a Jewish state, and they don't want to see a Jewish state. In any case, Israel denies all the allegations of genocide and ethnic cleansing. In fact, they say they've had to fight one of the hardest wars in history because they can't be seen to kill anybody unjustly. And that makes self-defense against Hamas incredibly difficult, a point which Hamas knows full well. Okay, so we've seen all these accusations going around, and we've seen the UK government showing itself to be a clown state. Let me know what you think in the comment section below of all this. Until next time, bye.